All right, on to Darwin. Okay, so Darwin was a cool guy. I think this is a great picture right here. He says, shh. Okay, so Darwin and evolution by natural selection is what this PowerPoint is going to be on. First, we're going to get a little bit of a history about Charles Darwin. He was a lost soul for a long time. He had a lot of education, but he had a lot of education in a lot of different areas and didn't really know where he wanted to go in life. I believe he was a cartographer for a bit, which means he was like a map maker and a map interpreter. And he wanted to explore. So his father told him to get his stuff together and sent him on a ship, the HMS Beagle, which was a navigational exploratory vessel. And it was just sailing around, scoping out islands in the area of the Galapagos. A good thing about Charles Darwin was that he made very detailed and artistic notes on the observations that he saw during his voyages. A lot of times with science, how we know things from the past are from people like Charles Darwin, who might not have been scientists technically or educationally, because that wasn't a very big field back then, but they were just very observant, curious people. So we need more people like that on the earth. You don't have to just be a scientist to be able to observe and hypothesize and make experiments. So that's a pretty important thing to know. So he noticed some things on the Galapagos Islands relating to finches and their beak length. So he noticed that these finches on the island looked like separate species from finches on the mainland, even though they were very similar. They had different beak lengths and different attitudes towards feeding and competition. So he noticed these things, which no one else had noticed previously, and started writing about them in his journal. And he made very detailed observations and pictures of these finches so that we can go back and look at them 125 years later, which is really awesome. And the main thing we're going to want to know is that Charles Darwin, he kind of spurred this hypothesis of natural selection as a mechanism for evolution. So that's important to get that right, because there are many things that spur evolution, and it's not just something that randomly happens all the time. There are usually mechanisms that are involved that create evolution. You don't just get like mutations and become an X-Man. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about evolution. So really general idea of evolution is when a species changes over time. So we can think about those finches that I was talking about. The finches on the mainland, some of them got blown over to the Galapagos Islands, and over time, they, due to competition, changed the way that their beaks were, the times of day that they came out, the prey that they went after, all sorts of things like that. So something happened to an original species, and then it changed over a long period of time to create these other species, independent species. And so it's important to know what a species is. And there have been many arguments over the 120 or so years that we've been talking about this. And basically, the modern idea of a species is when two organisms in a population reproduce and have a baby, and that baby is able to reproduce. Okay, so we're talking like when a horse and a donkey reproduce, they can reproduce, they create a mule. Mules are all sterile and infertile, so the mule is unable to reproduce, which means that donkeys and horses are from two separate species. Okay, so that's just an example. You don't always want to think about that, but it's a good example. Okay, and so the idea of fitness, this is like the biological imperative. Every single species relies on its fitness, and its fitness is its ability to survive and, more importantly, reproduce. So every single organism in the history of the earth, its main imperative is to transfer its genes to its next offspring. So it wants to reproduce. So to do that, we can look at like walruses or something. Larger walruses with larger tusks normally are better fighters. They can live longer because they can defend themselves. They can defend their harem of female walruses, and therefore are able to reproduce more successfully than smaller walruses. So that's just an example of fitness. And it goes to humans as well. There are certain traits that humans look at and look for and find more redeeming than other humans. And that is fitness. It's your biological imperative. So one of the main things that I want you to take out of this is that evolution is a slow process. It normally takes many, many generations, sometimes thousands of years. There are very, very special cases where due to something like a natural disaster or a block from a certain population where a species can change very quickly over time. But that's normally with very quick lifespan types of animals like small lizards or insects, that type of thing. So you can get through many generations in a very quick amount of time. So just think about generations. It takes many generations for evolution to occur. Okay, so there are, like I said, mechanisms for evolution. There is mutation, there's migration, which is gene flow, there's genetic drift, and there's natural selection, which is we're going to say it's the main process of evolution, is natural selection, that fitness. Here's a quick little link that I think all of you should go to and read a little bit about evolution, especially if you're interested, because it has all sorts of great things about these. I'll go quickly. Genetic drift, we're talking about random genes, random sequences of DNA changing, and then being inherited into another individual. So this doesn't happen quite that often because the fitness usually weeds that out, so to speak. So like Down syndrome is a genetic variation. You know, we still have people with Down syndrome, but there are less people with Down syndrome than there are without. So that's just one example. Migration, that's just, you know, like I said before, if a population gets separated from each other, sometimes they can turn into different species just due to migration or natural blockages from species. It's a really interesting thing to look at, but I don't want to get too far into it. And then mutation. And it's essential to remember that mutation is not evolution. If you get a mutation for a horn growing out of your head, as a human, that isn't going to help your chances to reproduce or survive, is it? It's not at all. So that mutation isn't going to be a mechanism for evolution. It's just a mutation. So the idea that I want to convey is that all of these things, natural selection, genetic drift, mutation, migration, they all have to do with fitness. Okay, so if there's a variation in your DNA and it doesn't make you more fit to survive or reproduce, the likelihood of your DNA being transferred onto more offspring is a lot lower. So that's just something to think about. And for the mutation, you know, think about a human with a horn. It's not going to be very likely that you're going to be able to reproduce. Okay, so I mean, there's someone for everybody, but just saying. So natural selection in Darwin. Darwin proposed that natural selection is the primary mechanism for evolution, and that's that fitness over time. Traits that are more fit for a certain population are going to be inherited, and those certain individuals are going to continue to be able to survive and reproduce. So natural selection is the process that selects variations that help with survival and help spread the variations to more offspring, and so fitness again. Darwin looked at the diversity of finch beaks on Galapagos in comparison with each other and with the mainland finches, and he realized that the mainland finches are a different species from the island finches, and we have since realized that the island finches are themselves different species as well. So that's very interesting. And so what spurred that Evolution for the island birds is competition for resources because on islands there are many, many less resources than on the mainland. So it's just that need to change so that you can survive and reproduce. So that's really interesting to think about. Island evolution is a very, very big topic in biology today for that reason, because you get an enclosed system that's a very small system that can change relatively quickly. So right here we've got number one, they've got big beaks, very strong beaks. So these finches were able to get into like walnuts, that type of thing, like hard nuts that these two birds would never be able to get into. Whereas these two birds, 3 and 4, they had small needle-like beaks, so they can get into certain areas that grubs may be hiding, and kind of be able to eat and continue to live with the limited resources that are on the island. And number 2 here, this is going to be kind of a mix between both. Sometimes there are animals that choose, or not choose, but are chosen to be able to kind of sit right in the middle. So they're not going to get all of number 1's nuts, and they're not going to get all of number 4's grubs, but they're going to go back and forth between both of them. And that's just the method of evolution that made, number 2 be able to be so effective and have this sort of beak structure. So that's just something to think about. They're not always going to be as clear as 1 and 4. We're going to have these in between, go between types of evolutions like 2 and 3. Okay, and so here is just real quick. You can see right here with color that over hundreds and thousands of years, these animals, their hair color changed so that it would be able to blend in better with the environment. So koalas were naturally on the ground. They started being able to climb with these very aggressive talons, claws on the front there, and strong hind legs. But since they're in the tree, they are more susceptible to attacks from like snakes and such, and birds and such. So they need to be able to camouflage. And as you can see, their fur is nearly identical to the color of the eucalyptus bark. And eucalyptus bark is this color. There's not very many other trees that look this way. So over thousands of years, these organisms changed their color so that they would be able to survive and reproduce and become more fit in the environment that they're in. And same thing with this gazelle here, or antelope here. It naturally has this color. It didn't choose to look like this. It was selected for through natural selection over thousands of years because of the habitat that it was in. So that's just something to think about. And that will be all on natural selection and Darwin's theory of natural selection as a mechanism for evolution. So if you have any more questions, like always, go ahead, give me a call, give me a text, message me in Schoology, however you want to, and I will be there for you. Otherwise, go ahead and check that link out. It'll give you a little more information on this, and if you are more curious about it, let me know, and I'll give you some cool information on evolution. And you can also just Google it. Google is a wonderful resource for that. So have a great rest of your week.